Hello guys, welcome back. This is the continuation series of ASP.NET Web API and React. In this session, we will practically demonstrate how to create the Web API. Let's create the REST API using ASP.NET Web API. To take it forward with this practical, we require two softwares initially: SQL Server Management Studio for managing the database and Visual Studio for creating the APIs in .NET as well. Let's begin with SQL Server Management Studio. I will connect with the local server with the development instance with Windows authentication as well. Let's create a database, new database. I'll name it as React Tutorial DB. Under this database, I'm supposed to create a new table. Afterwards, I'll write some columns or a fields, ID which is big int or integer, name which is varchar, designation which is also varchar. I'll keep them varchar max or 200. I also require location, that is also varchar 200. I'll make this ID as a primary key and I'll save this table with the name of TBL employee. Afterwards, we will insert some dummy data in this. I'll just refresh it and I'll edit top 200 rows. ID is 101, Karan Sharma, software developer, Chennai, Robert Smith, application developer, Chennai, and similarly I'll insert 10 records in this table. Then we will verify that whether the records are successfully inserted or not. Select star from TBL employee, and I'm already inside the React tutorials database. Once I'll execute this query, I'm having 10 employees in this TBL employee table. Now we will create ASP.NET Web API where we will write all the CRUD operations and will generate their APIs, and afterwards we will consume them using the React application as well. So let's switch to Visual Studio. I'm having 2017 version. Here we will create an empty project. Will go to Visual C# Web Projects category, ASP.NET Web Application. I'll name this project as Web API CRUD Logics. Afterwards, we need to select the project template. I can take empty or the Web API or any other as well. Let me select the empty project, and under the empty project I am selecting the folders related to Web API only. The reason why I am not selecting the Web API is Web API is just like a mini MVC project as well. So I don't want that. I am just simply write it for API part. So I'm just selecting an empty project, and here I'm adding the references and the folders for the Web API part only. Once we click OK, the project will be created with the basic architecture of ASP.NET Web API, where we have controllers and the models. We don't have views for this because it returns the data in JSON format. Afterwards, as we want all the CRUD operations with .NET application and the SQL Server, we require the entity framework from the Nugget packages. For that, I'll just right click over the project folder and manage Nugget packages. To install entity framework from Nugget, I'll go to browse for the online packages. We'll search for entity framework and I'll install this. After installing the entity framework from Nugget, we need to implement the database first approach with entity framework. Although we have three types of approaches: code first, database first, and model first. In this demonstration, we will take it with database first approach. In database first approach, it creates model codes like classes and properties and DB context from the database in the project folder based on the schema structure in database. So I'm going to right click over the models folder. I'll add a new item for the database first approach, that is ADO.NET data model. I'll name this as employee model. It will create a EDMX which is having all the schema designing from the database. I'll select from database and then I'll say quickly next. Wherever my database is there, accordingly I have to create a connection, and based on this connection it will create a connection string in web.config file. I'm selecting Microsoft SQL Server. I just need to switch to my SQL Server and take the instance name, that's my server name actually. I'm also using Windows authentication in connected mode. The database name in my case is React Tutorial DB, and I'll simply test the connection and I'll just say OK. Whatever name you will write it over here, accordingly the database connection string will be created and the DB context class will be generated. I'm just writing here employee DB context. So on the basis of this name, the connection string and the DB context file will be generated. I'll simply say next. Now here I need to select the tables which are needed to configure with our application through entity framework. If you have multiple tables, you can select whichever you want, but I am having only one. Make sure this table should have at least one primary key to take it forward with entity framework. Do not try to uncheck them. They are the most required checkboxes, and just say finish. Now we can see that the entity models are configured with the TBL employee that will be generated into its classes, properties and data context. If you have more than one table, it will also display or depict the relationship in the EDMX file as well. It will just create the employee model.edmx, and under this EDMX it will show the database diagram to you. I'll simply wait for a minute. It is generating the EDMX, hardly takes sometimes a couple of minutes. So it has generated this TBL employee. On the basis of this database, I can show it to you in my models folder. Here we have TBL employee.cs, which is a class generated from the EDMX. We have 4 properties in this: ID, name, designation and location as well. And when I go from the employee EDMX context file as well, the EDMX specification has the code files along with the database context as well. Afterwards, once it's being done, I'll just right click over a controller and I'll add a controller from this template. Now the question is which controller I need to select. To implement the API part, we just require the API 2 controller, but here we also have some other options with entity framework read-write actions using entity framework and all. Before taking any scaffolding usability, I recommend all of you guys to build your application once. I'm telling you why I'm using scaffolding here. This scaffolding option is basically generates the code automatically for CRUD operation. So when we use the Web API scaffolding with entity framework to create the dynamic code for doing create, read, update and delete. So I'll just right click and I'll say add the controller, and I'm selecting the Web API with actions using entity framework. In this case, all the CRUD operations code will be generated automatically. In this case, you require some additional information. The model class that is being generated from the EDMX, that is TBL employee. And second is the context class, data context class. I named my data context class as an employee DB context. And this is the name of the controller. I'll just simply name this as employees controller rather than TBL employees. And I'll simply say add. Make sure you already build your application before taking this step. Otherwise, you will fall into the error if you didn't rebuild your project after completion of the database first approach as well. After completing of this step, I can see that the employees controller is being generated, that is being inherited from the API controller, and it has all the APIs ready with us. Get API to get all the employees in this action method. After that, we have get employee by ID. After that, we have the put API, that is for update records. Then we have the post API to insert a new record or post a new object, and after that we have a delete employee action methods as well. Now just we need to once again rebuild and run our application. Sometimes we get the errors of IIS to be installed in our application. So make sure IIS must be configured while up and running your .NET application. I'll simply build my application. You have Ctrl+Shift+B as a shortcut key, or you can just go to this build and you can click over a build application as well. It's already building. Once the build succeeded, I'll just run my application. Now after running my application, as I discussed, it is giving the error because if we didn't enable directory browse in IIS in our application. So this is the HTTP error 403.14 forbidden. We can overcome this HTTP error in two ways. First is enable the directory browse in web config, and second is to enable in IIS as well. So I'm just going to my application. I'll stop running this application. I'll go to the web config file. Under this web config, under the system.web server, I'll just enable the directory browse, enable sets to true, and then I'll save my application and I'll run this again. Now when I run this application, this is only the API part. So I need to switch to the /API/ the name of the controller. By default, when I don't write any URI append with this, it will make a call to the get API and it will return all the records. When I'll simply write get by ID, so I'll just pass the optional parameter, and this will hitch to the second action method in this controller, get by ID, where it will pass the 101 or 102 into the ID parameter, and accordingly it will make a search of that. So here we have the get by ID, where I pass the ID as in 102. On the basis of ID, it finds the record and it returns that record to this TBL employee. And if the record not found, it will throw the exception. Otherwise, it will send the status OK with 200 and returns the object. In the case of just writing employees, it will return all the data from TBL employees and it will return as in JSON object as well. Now, if you would like to make the post, put and delete request, you require a REST easy or a Postman client application as well. Let's say I'm using the Postman for consuming the post request. So when I switch to the browser, the same URL will work for the post as well, employees. I'll just copy this. This is the place where I need to place the URL. Afterwards, from here I need to select the post request. Now we need to send the body where we write the object in the JSON format that we would like to send this object to the server as well. So here in the raw part, I need to send the data in the JSON format, whichever data you are supposed to post to your database or your TBL employee table. Make sure if you are passing the data in JSON format, in the header section, the content type should not be anything else. It should be application/JSON, right? Afterwards, when you will go to the body and you will send this request, it will return the error or exception if there is any issue comes. Otherwise, I think I am already having 11111 record. Let me make it as 112 and I send this request once again. It is saying that the content type interfere with some other things. Let me check it to application/JSON. I write it twice. Application/JSON, and once I send this request, it returns that 112 is successfully being created. I go to the database and I recheck it once that a record has been inserted with Rohit Sharma. Afterwards, you can also cross verify from this get request as well. Now there are 112 record is there with the tester designation as well. Similarly, if you are supposed to delete any record, let's say I would suppose to delete 112 record. So I just need to select the delete. For the deleting of the record, I do not require the body. So I just skip it. I'll just pass it 112 and the body is not required now. So I'll just remove it from here and I'll send it. And I can see that this particular record has been deleted because the status says OK, means the API called successfully. I'll just go back and I'll check that 112 record has been deleted successfully. So this is something how we have implemented all the CRUD operations using ASP.NET Web API with Entity Framework database first approach, and we have tested with API using Postman. That is a collection of APIs to be tested over here as in client side, and to determine whether the output is well structured or not, or the useful for the client application or not as well. So just like a Postman, we also have some other client side applications. So Postman is an application for testing the APIs, sending the request to the server and getting the error or response with the implementational changes back. Now further, if you would like to implement React as a front end in the application and ASP.NET Web API as a backend to create the API and consume them in React possible, that makes the end-to-end application well structured. We will discuss about creating the React as in front end and consuming the Web API part in the React application as well in the upcoming series. I hope you really understand all the CRUD operation and using the ASP.NET Web API as well. Thank you so much. Until next time, stay tuned.